Little Pigeon River, my dad was a sharecropper for a while, and then eventually we moved over to the little place we call Locust Ridge.
There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a television studio when someone realizes, in real time, that they have made a mistake they cannot undo. It is not the silence of mere confusion. It is the silence of quiet recognition. The kind that arrives a half-second too late, after the words are already out, after the cameras have already caught the exact moment a person's confidence curdled into something closer to dread. That silence fell over the view on the afternoon Joy Behar decided to tell Dolly Parton, to her face and on live national television, that one of the most beloved songs in American history was a betrayal of women everywhere. She did not whisper it. She did not soften it into a question. She said it the way people say things when they have said them before to applause, in rooms where nobody pushed back. And for one unguarded moment, she must have believed this room would behave the same way. It did not. Because what Joy Behar failed to calculate, what almost everyone fails to calculate when they meet Dolly Parton for the first time, or the 100th, is that underneath 60 years of rhinestones, self-deprecating one-liners, and a laugh engineered to put strangers instantly at ease, there is a woman built from something considerably harder than charm. And on that particular afternoon, in front of a live audience and several million people watching from their couches, that hardness rose to the surface just long enough to remind everyone exactly what it had survived to get there. What happened next would travel across the internet within hours. But to understand why it landed the way it did, why a 40-second exchange on a daytime talk show could feel less like a disagreement and more like a verdict, you have to go back. Not to the studio. Not even to the song. You have to go back to a hollow in the Tennessee mountains where a doctor once accepted a sack of cornmeal as payment for delivering a baby girl who would, 6 decades later, be underestimated on national television by someone who clearly never read past the wig. Dolly Rebecca Parton was born on January 19, 1946, the fourth of what would eventually be 12 children, in a one-room cabin near the Little Pigeon River in Sevier County. The walls did not keep out much. Winter came inside whether anyone invited it or not. Her father, Robert Lee Parton, never learned to read, but he understood land, labor, and the precise math of survival better than most men with degrees ever would. Her mother, Avi Lee, carried something different inside her, old Appalachian ballads passed down through generations, sung at the end of exhausting days, the kind of music that didn't need a stage because it had never known one. By 6, Dolly was singing in front of her grandfather's congregation. By 7, she had built her own guitar out of a broken mandolin, because a real one was not a possession her family could conjure. There is a story, often repeated but no less staggering each time, about a 6-year-old Dolly slicing her foot open on broken glass and her mother sewing the wound shut herself, with a needle and thread and whatever they had on hand, because a hospital simply was not part of the world they lived in. Children who grow up like that learn something most people spend their entire lives trying to fake. They learn that softness and weakness are not the same thing. They learn it early, and they never forget it. There is another detail people tend to skip past too quickly. The Parton family lived for a stretch on a piece of land called Locust Ridge, a name that sounds almost gentle until you understand what it actually meant in practice. It meant 2 rooms holding 12 children and 2 adults. It meant a single bathtub, filled once a week, shared in an order determined by something close to seniority. It meant winters where the cold did not stay outside, where it crept between the boards and settled into the corners of the house like an uninvited relative who never left. And it meant a 6-year-old girl already understanding, on some instinctive level, that nothing in her life was going to be handed to her gently. By 8, she had her first real guitar, purchased with money the family could not entirely spare, and she treated the instrument the way other children might treat something sacred. By 10, she was already appearing on local television out of Knoxville, singing in front of strangers like it was the most natural thing in the world. By 13, she had recorded her very first single, and by the time she walked across a high school stage to collect her diploma, she had already made a decision that most people twice her age would have called reckless. The day after her high school graduation in 1964, Dolly Parton packed what little she owned and left for Nashville. Nobody sent her. Nobody funded her. She simply decided that the life she had been handed was not the life she intended to keep, and she went and built a different one with her own hands. Nashville did not make it easy. The industry in the mid-1960s was constructed by men, for men, with women slotted into whatever narrow space remained. When Monument Records signed her, the first instinct was to file down everything distinctive about her voice, that bright, piercing, instantly recognizable tone, and aim her at something safer. Something the radio wouldn't have to think about. For a while, they tried to market her as a pop singer, slotting her into arrangements that smoothed over the very qualities that made her voice unforgettable in the first place. She let them try, because she understood something about patience that most people in her position would not have had the discipline to practice. She let them try, and she smiled, and underneath that smile she kept writing. She spent years placing songs with other artists before anyone trusted her to record her own material the way she actually heard it in her head. It was, in its own way, an apprenticeship in being underestimated, learning exactly how much skepticism a person could absorb without it curdling into bitterness, and exactly how to convert that skepticism into leverage once the right opportunity finally arrived. And then she quietly kept writing songs sharp enough and true enough that the label eventually had no choice but to let her record the kind of country music she had heard in her own head all along. Then came Porter Wagoner, and the television show that put her face into millions of American living rooms for the better part of a decade. The partnership worked, for a while, the way partnerships work when one person is content to stay inside the frame someone else built for them. Porter had discovered her, promoted her, and in many ways made her a household name long before her own catalog had fully caught up to her ambition, and he genuinely believed that arrangement could last indefinitely. But Dolly was never going to stay inside anyone's frame. She felt the ceiling lowering before Porter ever admitted it was there, sensed the exact moment where gratitude started shading into something closer to confinement, and when she finally told him she needed to leave, he refused to hear it. So she did the thing she has always done when ordinary conversation fails to carry the weight of what she's feeling. She wrote a song instead of an argument. She sat across from a man who did not want to let her go, and she sang him a goodbye so complete, so devastatingly tender, that there was nothing left for him to argue with. He cried. He agreed to produce the record on her way out the door, a final professional courtesy extended by a man who understood, even through his own heartbreak, exactly what he was hearing. That song was I Will Always Love You. It went to #1 in country music. Then it went to #1 again, a decade later, when she re-recorded it herself for the soundtrack of a film she also starred in. And then, in 1992, a young singer named Whitney Houston turned it into one of the most extraordinary vocal performances ever captured on a recording, a version that would go on to become one of the best-selling singles by a woman in music history. The royalties from that single use alone reportedly funded years of Dolly's children's literacy charity, an organization founded in her father's honor that has since placed well over 200 million free books into the hands of children who needed them, in communities her father's generation could never have imagined reaching. A song written to end one relationship became the financial foundation of an empire built to start millions of others, one child and one book at a time. This is the woman who sat down on The View that afternoon. Not a costume. Not a caricature built out of sequins and punchlines about her own appearance, the ones she has always deployed first, before anyone else gets the chance. A woman who clawed her way out of generational poverty using nothing but a voice nobody could categorize and a will nobody could bend. The segment began the way these segments always begin, warm, rehearsed, comfortable. Dolly was exactly who the audience expected her to be, funny, self-aware, generous with the kind of laughter that makes strangers feel like old friends. The panel moved through the usual rhythm of a daytime promotional stop, touching lightly on a new project before drifting, as these conversations often do, toward something more personal. And then the conversation turned toward Beyoncé's 2024 reinterpretation of Jolene, a version stripped of pleading and rebuilt around something closer to a warning. Joy Behar made her preference clear immediately. She liked the new version better. She said so plainly, and then she went further, calling the original Jolene anti-feminist, a song, in her framing, about a woman begging another woman not to take her man, a posture she considered outdated, even regressive, when measured against Beyoncé's harder, more defiant rewrite. It was delivered casually. Almost as an aside. The kind of comment people make when they assume nobody in the room is going to disagree, the kind of comment that works perfectly well in a green room or a writer's meeting, where everyone present already shares the same assumptions and nobody is sitting 12 feet away with 60 years of lived experience contradicting every word of it. For a fraction of a second, something shifted behind Dolly's eyes. Not anger exactly. Something quieter and far more dangerous than anger, recognition. She had heard a version of this exact critique before, in different decades, from different people, wearing different justifications. Sometimes it came from executives who thought her songwriting needed to be tougher. Sometimes it came from critics who thought her image needed to be more serious. And every single time, the message underneath it had been the same, that the way she chose to express her own fear, her own vulnerability, her own truth, was somehow not the correct way for a woman to feel. What almost nobody discussing this clip seems to remember is what Jolene actually was, and where it actually came from. It was not a thought experiment. It was not a feminist position paper set to a melody. It was written during the early years of Dolly's marriage to Carl Dean, inspired by an actual woman, a striking, red-haired bank teller who paid just a little too much attention to Dolly's husband for Dolly's comfort. By Dolly's own account, told and retold across decades of interviews, the encounters were innocent enough on the surface, the kind of casual flirtation most people would simply shrug off. But the fear it stirred in her was not casual at all. The song is not a performance of weakness. It is a documented record of real fear, the specific terror of watching someone else's eyes linger too long on the person you built your whole life around, and wondering, quietly, whether you are about to lose him. That is not anti-feminist. That is simply honest. And Dolly Parton has built an entire 60-year career on the radical, occasionally uncomfortable decision to tell the truth about what it actually feels like to be a woman, rather than what it is supposed to look like from the outside. She did not raise her voice on that set. She never does. She corrected the record the way she corrects everything, quietly, precisely, with a smile that never once slipped, because she has never needed volume to win an argument. She explained that Jolene was never a referendum on feminism. It was a snapshot of fear, frozen in a moment, handed to the world exactly as it happened, without editing it into something braver or more palatable. Calling that weak misunderstands what vulnerability actually costs. It is, in fact, considerably easier to write a song where the narrator threatens. It is much harder to write one where she simply admits she is afraid, and means it, and lets millions of strangers hear that fear without flinching. Reba McEntire, asked afterward what she made of Joy's comments, did not bother dignifying the framing with a rebuttal. She laughed, briefly, and then changed the subject to the weather. In the world Dolly and Reba came up through, that is not evasion. That is precisely how you signal that an opinion was not worth the breath it took to deliver, and the clip of that brief, dismissive laugh would end up circulating almost as widely as the original exchange itself. And Dolly herself, rather than treating Beyoncé's reimagined Jolene as a threat or a correction, appeared on the very album that contained it, introducing the track in her own voice, lending her blessing to an entirely different reading of a song she had carried for 50 years. She has said, in interviews since, that she was flattered an artist of Beyoncé's stature wanted to revisit the song at all, let alone reshape it into something that spoke to an entirely new generation of listeners. Because she understood something Joy Behar's comment had completely missed. Two women approaching the same fear from different angles are not in competition. They are simply proof that the original truth was strong enough to survive being told twice, in two different voices, 50 years apart. By the time the segment ended, something in the room had quietly recalibrated. The audience had come expecting warmth and easy laughs, and they got that, but they also got something else, a brief, unmistakable glimpse of exactly how Dolly Parton survives being underestimated, over and over, decade after decade, by people who assume the wigs and the rhinestones are the whole story. They are not the whole story. They have never been the whole story. They are armor, chosen deliberately, by a woman who decided a long time ago that being taken less seriously was a small price to pay for being left, mostly, alone to build exactly the life and the catalog and the legacy she wanted. The girl who was stitched back together with a sewing needle in a cabin with no doctor for miles did not grow into a woman who needed anyone's permission to call her own fear honest. She grew into a woman who could sit across from a national television panel, absorb an insult dressed up as cultural commentary, and dismantle it without ever once losing the smile that has disarmed far sharper critics than Joy Behar. That is the part of the story that never quite makes it into the headlines or the viral clips, the part that gets trimmed away because it doesn't fit neatly into a 30-second segment. Not the moment itself, but the 60 years of cornmeal and kerosene and rejected record labels and outgrown partnerships that had to happen first, quietly, off camera, long before anyone handed her a microphone and asked her to defend a song she wrote when she was still young enough to be terrified of losing everything. She is not soft. She has never been soft. She is simply patient, and precise, and entirely unwilling to let anyone else write the final word on what her own life has meant. She has spent 6 decades being introduced, again and again, as though she were a new discovery, a surprisingly sharp businesswoman hiding behind a costume, a surprisingly thoughtful songwriter hiding behind a punchline, a surprisingly resilient woman hiding behind a smile that never seems to falter. At some point, the surprise stops being about her and starts being about everyone else's refusal to update what they think they already know. And that, more than any single exchange on any single afternoon, is the reason this particular clip refuses to disappear. Because it was never really about a song at all. It was about what happens when the world finally runs out of new ways to underestimate Dolly Parton, and discovers, yet again, that she was 3 steps ahead the entire time. If there is a lesson buried inside that brief exchange on a daytime talk show, it is probably this. The people who survive the longest in any industry are rarely the loudest in the room. They are the ones who learned, early and the hard way, exactly what they are made of, and who no longer feel the need to prove it to anyone who happens to doubt them on a given Tuesday afternoon. Dolly Parton figured that out somewhere around the time her mother was threading a needle by lamplight, and she has never once had to relearn it since.